Well, happy feast day of St. George. Love St. George. And when I was a young dad with a little boy, my firstborn son, he loved knights. We'd always tell stories about knights. And I incorporated one of the characters was George. It was a young boy. And it was the idea that St. George was a young man and kind of beginning his journeys. And I started to realize that the historical George was at the same time as Saint Nicholas and Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Christopher and a lot of the great saints that have been forgotten and neglected. And so I began to weave together these bedtime stories for my son when he was a little boy, and then the other kids as they grew up, with these saints meeting each other, and then eventually they meet Constantine, and they're all in different parts of the Roman Empire, but they all have a common interest and a common story. And so I wanted to weave that together. And a priest friend of mine, I was kind of telling him about it. He said, "That's pretty good. You should make it into a book." So over the years, all these stories that were told about St. George to my kids became a novel. It was called Sword and Serpent. You can, I think, see it there on the screen. It's a brown covered book. It has an arm with a sword going into the mouth of a dragon. And that book is it's a wonderful book. I love it. It's received a lot of reviews, and I thank everyone who's read it and written a review. It's the story of how George finds his way, how he loses his parents, how he gets himself to Rome, and ultimately how he comes in contact with evil, with preternatural forces, with demonic possession. And I don't want to give away the book in case you want to read it. I will do some Q&A at the end, as long as you guys who have read it don't do many spoilers. But he does engage a dragon. And it's not what you expect, but it is truly a dragon at the end of the novel. So it climaxes with him meeting and then engaging with the demonic, with the satanic. And it is written for young adults, so teenagers can read this. I think little kids would be spooked out by these novels. There's a lot of martyrdom in it. There is blood. There is animal sacrifice. There is Roman religion and Roman, pagan priestesses and priests. And it's very vivid and all of that. And a lot of the book is about demonic possession. But of course, redemption through Christ, and it's not preachy or anything like that. It doesn't read like a Left Behind movie or anything. And then the second book picks up in Egypt, and it brings in Catherine of Alexandria, and it starts bringing into the plot Constantine and Helena. So all of this is happening. The book begins at the beginning of the Diocletian persecution, 297, 98, 99. And the book runs up to 303 AD. And you'll know Constantine has his conversion around 312, 313. So in this trilogy that I've written, Constantine comes into the story, and you see that he and Helena are being influenced by underground bishops, martyrs, and things that are starting to happen in the empire. And in the book, it's telling the story of how these seeds of martyrdom and of blood are being planted throughout the entire Roman Empire, not just in Rome itself, preparing the empire to become Catholic, for the conversion of an emperor, where we go from masses in catacombs, secrecy, bishops in secret, and then within a generation we have basilicas being built. St. Peter's Basilica on the Vatican, St. Paul's outside the wall, the Lateran Palace turned into the cathedral, St. John Lateran. All these things happen in a generation. And so this trilogy, this historical fiction trilogy that I wrote, is reimagining what that might look like 5 to 10 years before everything starts flipping and moving Christian. So if you're home alone, you're at Corona, you can't get out, you're tired of watching TV, you're looking for a good book, today's the feast of St. George, And I'd like to encourage you, it's kind of a commercial here, get the first book, get Sword and Serpent, and give it a read. I'll just kind of give you a summary. So the first book is leading George and leading up to George and his encounter with the dragon. And as I wrote this, I wanted the dragon to obviously be real and be demonic, but not be like a dinosaur. So if you read the book, you'll see how it's done. I think it's done well. The second book covers Egypt, and it brings in a lot of stuff in Rome, gladiatorial games, mystery, Constantine, those type things, and it's a bridge book. And then, man, I really think maybe this is the best one. It's the last one, Storm of Fire and Blood. It's the longest one, and it brings in Constantine and Helena. It also sets up the whole saga of the Arthurian legend. It explains what the sword and the stone is. It explains who Merlin is, all within a historical Catholic viewpoint. And if you know what happened to St. George in history, you probably know the end of this book. But it also incorporates St. Helena and St. Constantine at the very end, and you all know the rest of the story. She's Catholic, he becomes Catholic, and the Roman Empire converts. So it's a fun story. Along the way, you see not only St. George, but you see St. Christopher is his companion. St. Nicholas is, in a way, his spiritual director, his guide. He's in the book. He is somewhat like a Padre Pio character. St. Nicholas in this book is a young man. He's a young priest. He's not an old. He's not the St. Nicholas at the Council of Nicaea in 325. This is St. Nicholas 25 years earlier as a young priest. But he's extremely holy, and he can bilocate, and he can prophesy, and he can cast out demons. He's a very powerful priest and a very powerful monk in the book. So he's sort of like I said, like a Padre Pio. He's kind of a Gandalf. He's kind of a Obi-Wan Kenobi type influencer upon the main character, who's George. And then, you also meet St. Blaise from Armenia. He's at this time period. You meet some Roman saints. You meet Pope Marcellinus. He features prominently. He's in the catacombs in Rome when St. George gets there. And there's people who read the novels like to talk to one another and find saints, like little Easter eggs that are hidden throughout the book. And then many of these saints, of course, during this time period were actual martyrs. And so you see them depicted in their gruesome, horrible deaths, but they're uniting their deaths to Jesus Christ. So it's actually quite beautiful. So that's why I think maybe little kids should maybe not be exposed to these books because of the reality of martyrdom. But I think any young person certainly over 14, but probably over 11 could handle the content. So if you're interested in a good read, I'd say give it a shot. Buy the first book and let me know. And before I sign off here, since today was St. George, I want to talk about the book I'd written about St. George. If you have any questions about the book, I'll stay on here for maybe another 5 minutes or so and answer some questions. And then tomorrow we'll resume our regular schedule Friday morning. I see Catholicism is in our chat. He just had a book that came out. I saw that on Instagram. But yeah, if you have any questions on this book, let me know. Otherwise, we can wrap it up. Here's one. Laura, she asked, would this be a good book for an agnostic to read? Actually, yeah. A lot of people who aren't Catholic, who aren't Christian, who aren't even believers have read this book. They got it at Barnes & Noble or whatever and read it and really did enjoy it. The book is not preachy. You're not going to read along and like, now you must accept Jesus into your heart. None of it. The book doesn't read that way. In fact, George starts off basically knowing nothing about Christianity. And the influence and what he does learn along the way is observed and it's not dictated. So the book, a lot of people have said they liked the trilogy because it had deep Catholic themes that a lot of people honestly might even miss. You know, they might not understand that they're even in a catacomb, or that a liturgy is happening, or that this man is a bishop. There's only very subtle signs about it. But if you're watching, you realize what's going on in the book. So yeah, I think a non-believer or an agnostic would very much enjoy it. It's definitely, you don't have to be a Catholic to like it. And of course, a lot of Protestants have read it and enjoyed it as well. So yeah, I think that's good. The next one is Apostolato Petrino. Was there a real dragon? Historically, the icon that you see of George and the Dragon, and I have a YouTube video on this. I think I have 2 YouTube videos on it. You see George on a white horse. He has a long spear by which he is stabbing, killing the dragon. Then you see off to the side a young maiden who has sort of a lasso around the neck of the dragon, and this is her girdle, and it symbolizes her virginity. So the idea here is her virginity is making the dragon weak. It's binding the dragon so that George can kill it. I'll explain what that means in just a minute. And then in the background, you see a city. The medieval legend is that it's the city of Cyrene. In my book, Sword and Serpent, I reinterpret that as Cyrene, which is the city where St. Simon of Cyrene came from. He's the man who helped our Lord Christ carry the cross. And so in my book, I have it set up, this is not historical, that Simon of Cyrene gets a splinter in his hand while carrying the cross of Christ. And after the resurrection, he realizes who Christ was and who he assisted. And he saves that splinter as a memento and eventually gives it to the Blessed Mother, who eventually gives it to the first bishop of Jerusalem, James, who keeps it as a relic. So there's a relic of the cross even before Helena finds the cross from Simon of Cyrene. That's my version, my historical fiction, not actual history. That's in Sword and Serpent. But that icon symbolizes George. The name George, Gergos, means farmer, worker of the earth. Adam was a worker of the earth. Christ was a farmer, gardener, in the sense that he came to be the new Adam. And when Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, she thinks Christ is the gardener, which is it's true, but it's also a symbol that he's the new Adam in the garden. So George, in a way, is a sign of Christ. He's a new Adam. He's on a white horse. Christ is on a white horse in the Apocalypse. I have a video on, lots of videos, about 15 videos, I think, on YouTube on the book of the Apocalypse, go through every verse of it. But Christ rides a white horse. The white horse stands for strength and purity and virtue. The woman, the girl, who's holding the dragon with her girdle, the sign of her virginity, is a sign of the church. So the church is the virgin's spouse, and her virginity, especially the virginity and the temperance of the female religious, but also of the clergy, who are supposed to be chaste, as they were in the early church, is weakening Satan so that he can be destroyed. So it's ultimately St. George or Christ who destroys Satan, but it's also the church that's binding Satan by its virtue, by her virginity, her chastity. And then in the background, you see the city, which is, of course, in the medieval tradition, Cyrene or Cyrene, but it can stand also for the Roman Empire, the city of Rome, the city of man, being converted by these actions of destroying the dragon into the city of God. So the St. George icon is loaded. It's a very, very beautiful image, and there's a lot of symbolism going on there. And so I want to take all that and make it into a novel. So in my book, is there really a dragon? Yes. But in my book, it's not a T-Rex. It's not a Barney. It's a demon. At the end of the book, when George meets the dragon, it's a very serious, scary, demonic, haunting apparition. Kind of gave it away. Maybe I shouldn't have said so much. But yeah, in my novel, it's a demonic apparition that George has to handle, that St. George has to conquer, which of course he does. Okay, maybe take another. Um, okay, so Luke here, he says, can I read Storm of Fire and Blood if I haven't read the other two books? Yeah, all three books stand alone. Of course, they're all building on each other, but I think the third book is the best because obviously we all know George is a martyr, so it has a pretty amazing and awesome ending. But you're not going to really know the character George unless you read the first two books. So I would say read the first book first. Um, but I do know people who've read them out of order. Kind of cringe on that. I wish you read them in order. But yeah, I mean, they all stand alone. But I would say pretty please, as the author, start with Sword and Serpent. Andrew asks, how do you write, Dr. Marshall? Are you a little but often kind, or do you go into seclusion? Um, I go into seclusion when I write. So even if it's, if I'm writing a book like Infiltration, there's a time of research, and then there's a time of writing, maybe 7 hours a day or 8 hours a day, and then at the end of all that, I throw away about 30% of what I've written. And the same with any book. Um, it's usually really intense periods, and then that period is over, and then I say I'm never going to write a book again, and then after about 8 months, do another one. Writing Infiltration was really hard, so I'm not currently writing something, but I will here soon. So I'll do another couple. Amanda says, I just ordered the paperbacks. I have the first one on the Kindle and I love it. I know my boys are going to enjoy them. 14 and 11 are the oldest. Absolutely. I originally wrote these for young adults. Most people who read these are actually adults. When I hear from people, they're adults. But man, I think the sweet spot would be a 14-year-old boy or girl. There's a lot of female characters too. It's not just a boys book. In fact, the first book has Sabra. She's the possessed girl who's under the influence of the demonic, and she's a really beautiful character and a major part of that. A lot of people say when they read the first book that Sabra, who's the female character, they like even more than St. George. So, yeah. Catholicism asks, do you write modern sort of dialogue, or is it written in a sort of classical vernacular? It's interesting. These books it's modern, but not like street English, not like that. It's modern, but there's tons of Latin in the dialogue. So anytime there's a reference to anything that's Roman in the book, which is every single page, I retain the Latin word there. And it's not, or titles. So when they address someone, they don't say, if they're addressing the emperor, they don't say sir. They say domine, O Lord. If there's an incantation or something, sometimes a prayer or a psalm, that will be retained in Latin or Greek, depending on the context in the book. And then every single book, at the end of every book, is a lexicon of every single Latin word that I used in the book. So if you're reading along and one of the characters says a Latin word, refers to something Roman and uses a Latin word, and you know, what exactly does that mean? You can turn to the back and you can look it up. So for example, a codex. Instead of saying a book, they'll say a codex. Or, for example, they'll refer to a decurio, which is a cavalry officer who commanded a unit of 10 horsemen. So I don't write cavalry officer. I use the Latin terminology throughout the book. Instead of saying a duke, I'll say dux, D-U-X. What else? Oh, if they talk about the sign of the cross, they use signum. So those kind of things happen throughout the book, and it's a set Latin vocab. So as you read, and if you don't know some of the books or some of the words, you can look in the back. But honestly, if you read all three books, you would probably have a good Latin vocab set of, 200, 300 words along the way. So yeah, so it's in a vernacular. It's not like, that's cool, man. They don't talk, groovy, dude. There's none of that. They talk respectably, but And then there is kind of the interesting element of the Latin that's sprinkled probably almost on every page, or every at least 2 or 3 pages. There's Latin in there. So I think it's kind of cool. Most people are maybe intimidated, but once they get into it, they think it's cool. And then there's some people, I got to tell you, they read the whole thing and they didn't know there was the lexicon at the end of the book. So they kind of struggled with all these words, or they looked them up on their own. And then they got to the end of the book and they realized every single word in Latin was in there. I think book 1 explains to people at the beginning of the book, hey, the words are in the back, but for somehow that didn't happen in books 2 and 3. Now you know. Now you know. I'll do one more question here on books or writing. How real, this is good right here. This is Abigail. How real or fictional are these books? So anything that happened in history that's in the book is depicted as factual and real as possible. So, for example, if I know Constantine was in this province or in this city during a certain season or year, I'm not going to change that. You can look in a history book and say, when was Constantine in this year? Where was he? Okay, in the book, that's where Constantine's going to be. So I'm not going to mess with that. If a certain saint was a certain ethnicity from a certain town or spoke a certain language, I am going to make sure that that happens in the book. Obviously, or if he dies a certain way, that's exactly how that saint is going to be martyred. Now, clearly, the conversations that they're having with one another, or maybe they do travel somewhere together, there's no historical record of that. So I'm making that up. That's fiction. But everything that has to do with dates, geography, historical characters that you could look up in a book, or you could go to put their name in Wikipedia and they're going to come up. All that stuff has been researched, and their historical points are correctly attributed in the book, but everything else around that is fictional. So it's a historical fictional book. Yeah, I think that does it. So, all right, well, I'm going to sign off. It's the Feast of St. George today, and our family. Have you ever been to medieval times? It's like a jousting event. You pay money, and there's guys. It's kind of like a fake wrestling, but there's guys in suits of armor, and they're wrestling and fighting and jousting, and there's battle axes and hawks. Well, since there's Corona, we're locked in the house. So in a little bit, we are all gonna, myself, Joy, and the 8 kids are gonna dress up like medieval or Romans or whatever, and we're gonna have some jousting, and we're gonna have some sport, and we're gonna get out our bearded dragon, and he's gonna be a featured guest. We have a pet bearded dragon who goes by several names, such as Jojo and Sylvester. And we're going to have jousting, and we're going to have fighting, and then we're going to eat roasted chicken and ribs, and we're going to have no silverware, and we're going to drink out of cups and chalices, and we're going to throw our bones in the yard, and we're going to have a homemade martial medieval times in honor of St. George, the first great Christian knight. He is the first great, I guess, actually, he may not be the first. There were other military Catholics who died before him, but he's one of the first. So in honor of Catholic chivalry and St. George and all that, we'll be doing that tonight. So maybe you could do it. Let me get some ribs, get some chicken, get some jousting, get some of those pool noodles, styrofoam pool noodles, and run around and hit each other and have fun. The boys are going to love it, and the girls will dress up like princesses. But in the meantime, if you're locked down and you want to find a good, wholesome, well-written, fun novel, get into my trilogy. Get that first book, Sword and Serpent. It's how many pages? Hold on. The whole series together is, I think, 1,453 pages total. It's just the whole trilogy is just a little bit longer than Lord of the Rings. So the first book is 390 pages. You can read it. Some people read it in a few sittings. It's fun. It's a page turner. Lots of cliffhangers. Lots of suspense. Lots of cool characters. Lots of saints. You'll like it. So get Sword and Serpent. If you're a parent, you'll like it too. Read it to your kids. I love meeting young adults, even college students who have read all three, and they show them to me. They're all marked up, and I love to sign them. I love to meet young people who like them. I do all this stuff like infiltration, and Cardinals and Vigano and Scandals and Vatican Bank and Holy Week liturgy. I mean, all this stuff. But this is fun. This is Taylor Marshall having fun. If you want to see me having fun, read Sword and Serpent. I think you'll enjoy it. And funny comment about Casca, who's one of the villains in the book. If you have read it, thank you. And if you have read and you haven't left a review, please go to Amazon and leave a review. I'm going to put a link up just now to the Sword and Serpent book 1. I'll put it right on here. There it is. Sword and Serpent book 1. Go get it. And I think you'll enjoy. And if you do, then you can read book 2 and book 3. I got a note from a lady today. She said, I just finished book 3. Oh my goodness. Can't believe it. I'm so bummed that there's no more books. It's the end. And it is the end. Once you're martyred, that's the end of the story here on earth. Of course, he goes on to heaven. But I don't know how to write that story. So check it out. Sword and Serpent. Happy Feast of St. George. And go out there and slay dragons. See you tomorrow, Friday, 9 a.m. Central. Godspeed.